Hello. We've had the first fogs of autumn in parts of the UK, so I thought it was time for an autumnal post on fog. Fog's a feature particularly in That Hideous Strength, the last of Lewis's space trilogy. And there comes a day when we're told the first real fog of autumn had descended on Belbury that morning, so that Mark Studdock is eating his breakfast by artificial light. And Belbury is the headquarters of an evil organisation called the NICE, National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, where Mark is investigating an apparent job opportunity. A general sense that something's not quite right is maybe suggested by the seemingly innocent detail that the post and the newspaper are late being delivered on this foggy morning. And when the post does arrive, there's a letter for Mark which rather disquietingly lets him know that the college in the nearby town of Edgestowe, where he has a fellowship, believes he's already resigning his position. It's an unsettling, long, rather aimless day for Mark, wandering about Belbury with nothing much to do. At one point, he opened the front door and looked out. The fog was thick, wet and cold. And throughout the chapter, there are these brief references to the cold and the fog. And it's the same for his wife, Jane, in the town of Edgestowe, not very far away. She too is having some pretty empty and unsettling days. In town, she meets the Denistons, and they suggest a picnic out of town, somewhere private. A restaurant would hardly do, Mrs. Studdock, says Deniston. We want to be private. The we obviously meant we three, and established at once a pleasant, business-like unity between them. As well, he continued, don't you like a rather foggy day in a wood in autumn? You'll find we shall be perfectly warm sitting in the car. Jane said she'd never heard of anyone liking fogs before, but she didn't mind trying. All three got in. That's why Camilla and I got married, said Deniston as they drove off. We both like weather. Not this or that kind of weather, but just weather. It's a useful taste if one lives in England. However did you learn to do that, Mr. Deniston, said Jane. I don't think I should ever learn to like rain or snow. It's the other way round, said Deniston. Everyone begins as a child by liking weather. You learn the art of disliking it as you grow up. Haven't you ever noticed it on a snowy day? The grown-ups are all going about with long faces, but look at the children and the dogs. They know what snow's made for. I'm sure I hated wet days as a child, said Jane. That's because the grown-ups kept you in, said Camilla. Any child loves rain if it's allowed to go out and paddle about in it. Well, this is pure C.S. Lewis, you know. He really loved weather, provided it's not the bright, hot days of summer. Didn't like that. And his favourite season was always autumn. In Surprised by Joy, his autobiography, he tells us that the first lifelong friend that he made when he went up to Oxford as a student was a man called Jenkin. He continued my education as a seeing, listening, smelling, receptive creature. Jenkin seemed to be able to enjoy everything, even ugliness. I learned from him that we should attempt a total surrender to whatever atmosphere was offering itself at the moment. On a dismal day, to find the most dismal and dripping wood. On a windy day, to seek the windiest ridge. It was a serious yet gleeful determination to rub one's nose in the very quiddity of each thing, to rejoice in its being so magnificently what it was. So here in That Hideous Strength is an expression of this joy in the most dismal and dripping wood. Presently they left the unfenced road behind Sandown and went bumping across grass and among trees, and finally came to rest in a sort of little grassy bay with a fir thicket on one side and a group of beeches on the other. There were wet cobwebs and a rich autumnal smell all round them, sort of atmospheric stuff that Lewis loved. Then all three sat together in the back of the car, and there was some unstrapping of baskets, and then sandwiches and a little flask of sherry, and finally hot coffee and cigarettes. Jane was beginning to enjoy herself. And then later on, when they go for a little walk, it was warmer in the open air than it had now become in the car, warm and full of leafy smells and dampness and the small noise of dripping branches. And in this situation, which I'm afraid reminds me of wet bank holiday days out in England, sitting in the car with the windows steaming up, eating sandwiches. But Jane is given very important information. Well, there's nothing unusual about a few foggy days in autumn, but the following chapter is called Fog, and it becomes something much more sinister. The fog, which covered Edgestow as well as Belbury, continued and grew denser. At Edgestow, one regarded it as coming up from the river, but in reality it lay all over the heart of England. It blanketed the whole town so that walls dripped and you could write your name in the dampness on tables, and men worked by artificial light at midday. It begins to feel a little unnatural. And the peak of the fog is at the funeral of Hengist. Hengist is a character who's had the temerity to leave the Nice, to walk away from it all, and is murdered as he goes, clearly by agents of the Nice. And with the circumstances of his death and the fog, there's something very surreal and sinister about the funeral. It was the third and thickest day of the fog, which was now so dense and white that men's eyes smarted from looking at it, and all distant sounds were annihilated. Only the drip from eaves and trees and the shouts of the workmen outside chapel were audible within the college. Inside the chapel the candles burned with straight flames, each flame the centre of a globe of greasy luminosity, and cast almost no light on the building as a whole. But for the coughing and shuffling of feet, one would not have known that the stalls were quite full. Curry, black-suited and black-gowned and looming unnaturally large, went to and fro at the western end of the chapel, whispering and peering, anxious lest the fog might delay the arrival of what he called the remains. And then the organ began to play and drowned both the coughing within and the harsher noise without, the monotonously ill-tempered voices, the rattle of iron, the vibrating shocks with which loads were flung from time to time against the chapel wall. But the fog had, as Curry feared, delayed the coffin, and the organist had been playing for half an hour before there came a stir about the door, and the family mourners, the black-clad Hengists of both sexes with their ramrod backs and country faces, began to be ushered into the stalls reserved for them. And then came maces and beadles and censors and the great rector of Edgestow, and then singing, the choir, and finally the coffin, an island of flowers drifting indistinctly through the fog, which seemed to have poured in thicker, colder and wetter with the opening of the door. The service began. Because the description of the coming of the fog started at Belbury, the headquarters of the Nice. Could it be, we wonder, that the fog is emanating from there, out to envelop the town of Edgestow, and not only that, but extending throughout the heart of England? It reminds me of the November fog at the beginning of Dickens' Bleak House, which creeps and rolls round London, and at the very heart of the fog sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. And the fog there is an emblem of the law, dysfunctional and unjust. And in Lewis's book, it's an emblem of the evil perversion of the nice, which threatens to topple Britain. But the chapter ends with the experience of Jane going to seek help at the manor in St Anne's on the Hill, a village also outside Edgestow, which is the headquarters of opposition to the nice and the locus of all goodness in the novel. She looked ahead. Surely that bend in the road was more visible than it ought to be in such a fog. Or was it only that a country fog was different from a town one? Certainly what had been grey was becoming white, almost dazzlingly white. A few yards further, and luminous blue was showing overhead, and trees cast shadows. She'd not seen a shadow for days. And then all of a sudden the enormous spaces of the sky had become visible, and the pale golden sun, and looking back, she took the turn to the manor. As she took the turn to the manor, Jane saw that she was standing on the shore of a little green sunlit island, looking down on a sea of white fog, furrowed and ridged, yet level on the whole, which spread as far as she could see. And there were other islands too. That dark one to the west was the wooded hills above Sandown, where she'd picnicked with the Denistons. And the far bigger and brighter one to the north was the many caverned hills, mountains one could nearly call them, in which the wind had its source. She took a deep breath. It was the size of this world above the fog which impressed her. Down in Edgestowe all these days one had lived, even when out of doors, as if in a room, for only objects close at hand were visible. She felt she'd come near to forgetting how big the sky is, how remote the horizon. And the brightness, the colour and the beauty above the fog signify hope, something divine even. The fog will pass. It can never reach high enough to smother the glory which is above it. And above all, for Jane, it's the hugeness above the fog which impresses her, something much bigger than herself. Her world is about to be all turned around. The sunlight will prevail.